Shalom, good evening. This is TV7 Israel News broadcast to you from Jerusalem. And in today's top stories, Israel holds a wide-scale military exercise on its northern front, simulating a multi-sector conflict vis-à-vis Iran and its proxies. Turkey rejects calls for de-escalation as it continues to prepare for an all-out cross-border offensive vis-à-vis Syria. At a time when the international community voices broad rebuke of Iran's brutal crackdown of civilian protests, the Ayatollah regime praises its revolutionary Basij forces as they seemingly prepare for an escalation. Israel's activity against terror elements throughout the West Bank districts of Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley unceasingly persist. IDF, ISA or Shin Bet, and Border Police Special Operations Forces conducted extensive counter-terrorism activities as part of Operation Wavebreaker over the weekend. As a result, 23 suspected terror operatives were apprehended, and a relatively large amount of weapons were seized. And while a number of exchanges of fire were cited, no injuries were thankfully reported among the Israeli troops. Meanwhile, the IDF has launched a wide-scale military exercise in its northern region yesterday, a pre-scheduled drill that is expected to end on Thursday. As part of the exercise, an alert movement of IDF forces is evident throughout northern Israel, as the Israel Defense Forces are actively working to bolster their readiness for multi-arena operative scenarios, with an emphasis on emergency mechanisms, headquarters, and the integration of ground and air capabilities in combat. And while Israel seemingly maintains its preparedness for any plausible conflict with Iran and its proxies in both Lebanon, Syria, and beyond, the northern part of Syria is subject to intensive artillery and aerial bombardments by Turkish forces, which are seemingly amassing along the Turkey-Syria front in preparation for an all-out cross-border offensive. Meanwhile, amid widespread calls for de-escalation of Turkey's intention to launch its invasion into Syria, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in a public address to supporters of his AK party in the city of Istanbul, proclaimed that no one has the right to limit Turkey's security-related activity.
Türkiye kendi güvenliği için, sınırları içinde ve sınırları dışında belirlediği alanlarda her türlü tasarruf hakkına sahiptir. Bu hakkımızı kullanmamızın önüne kimse geçemez.
Meanwhile, joining in, voicing concern over Turkey's looming invasion of its southern neighbor Syria, EU Foreign Policy and Security spokesman Peter Stano highlighted Brussels' concern.
Of course, the European Union is watching the developments very, very closely, and the European Union is concerned about the recent escalation of violence in Syria, in Turkey, and in Iraq. And we are also concerned about the casualties caused. We express, of course, our condolences for the loss of innocent civilian life, and the European Union calls for restraint and for urgent de-escalation. We reiterate again our support for a full nationwide ceasefire in Syria, and the European Union remains committed to the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria as well as of Iraq.
Stano was separately asked about repeated cross-border attacks by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps against Iraq's northern Kurdistan region, highlighting that Tehran's unprovoked aggression is unacceptable and must cease immediately.
These attacks are unacceptable. They have to stop. They constitute a violation of Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So we call on Revolutionary Guards and on Iran in general to stop these cross-border attacks.
It is important to explain that the Ayatollah regime has conveniently accused Iranian Kurdish dissidents residing in Iraq of supporting their compatriots in Iran amid ongoing social unrest prevalent throughout Iran, with calls for reform and regime change met by a brutal crackdown. Consequently, the Ayatollah regime instructed its Revolutionary Guards Corps to target bases of Iran's Kurdish dissidents in Iraq, claiming the lives of at least 12 civilians to date.
داخل أمره للكمان الإسلامي إيران وبارك كان حزب ديمقراط وماران كران شهيد برينداريان من بكو بربرين خوشخانه شهيد دكتور خالد أمارك رسمية بإرادة جنم دو شهيدانية هشت برينداريانية.
طبيعتاً ما عندك كارو برنامج وبخلال آماده کاری خمال من هبو أو شنانيش كأو بريندار وشهيد من داوا از ما أي هزي كشمرجة من بو لو دورو برا تنيا بو حرسيات ونجاباني لكلو أمالي حزبي لهيون أنا شوني عسكريين بو.
While cross-border strikes have become a regular occurrence, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps are in tandem reinforcing their forces along the Iran-Iraq border with armored units, claiming the deployment is meant to prevent infiltration of cells of Kurdish parties based in Iraqi Kurdistan. Meanwhile, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights revealed last week that Iran's brutal crackdown primarily focuses on the Iranian Kurdish minority, whose member, the late Mahsa Amini, who was murdered by the so-called morality police over failing to wear a headscarf properly in accordance with the regime's guidelines, triggered the nationwide social unrest.
Sources say over 40 people have been killed in mainly Kurdish cities in the past week alone. Significant numbers of security forces have also been deployed in recent days. Overnight, we received reports of security forces responding forcefully to protests in several mainly Kurdish cities, including Javanrud and Sakes.
The UN High Commissioner's office further highlighted that between the 15th of July and the 22nd of November, more than 300 Iranians have already been killed, including more than 40 children.
Since the nationwide protests began on the 16th of September, over 300 people have been killed, including more than 40 children. 2 16-year-old boys were among 6 killed over the weekend. Protesters have been killed in 25 of Iran's 31 provinces, including more than 100 in Sistan and Baluchistan.
The Ayatollah regime's crackdown is spearheaded by its revolutionary Basij forces, which have sustained numerous casualties of their own. And while growing resentment of the Basij over its conduct is also cited in areas which are widely supportive of the Islamic regime, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei highlighted in an address to his supporters that he approves of their so-called sacrifice.
دیدید تو این قضایای اخیر بسیجی‌های مظلوم خودشون مظلوم واقع شدن برای اینکه نگذارن ملت مظلوم یک مشت اغتشاشگر غافل یا جاهل یا مزدور بشه. خودشون مظلوم واقع میشن برای اینکه جلوی ظلم دیگران رو بگیرن.
Returning to Brussels, where the EU foreign policy and security spokesman Peter Stano voiced the European institutions' outrage over Tehran's brutal human rights abuses, and also highlighted the European Union's steadfast opposition to Iran's military support for Russia in its war against Ukraine.
This is something unacceptable. Russia is involved in illegal war against Ukraine. We are witnessing, especially in these days, the increased brutality and the aggressiveness and inhumanity of the attacks Putin is ordering against civilian targets in Ukraine, against civilians in Ukraine, knocking out electricity. Millions of people in Ukraine are without electricity. Half of Moldova population is without electricity as a consequence of these illegal, cruel, barbaric, illegal actions. So, of course, anyone who is supporting Russia in this behavior will be taken into account. And in connection to supplies, especially of Iranian drones to Russia, the European Union has already adopted sanctions. And we have said very clearly that we are monitoring this issue. And if there is a need, the European Union and its member states will continue to act in this regard.
Despite Iran's human rights abuses, military support for Russia, and cross-border attacks into Iraq, The European Union, nonetheless, as coordinator of the so-called JCPOA, continues to work tirelessly with the aim of reinvigorating the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran.
On the JCPOA, of course, we are continuing. The High Representative and his team, as a coordinator of the JCPOA, continues very intense outreach to the partners in order to make sure that we go back to the full delivery of the JCPOA, that we have a deal, but it's very difficult. The High Representative was talking about it also last week on Monday after the FAC, that we are in a very difficult situation, but still we are investing a lot of efforts to move this issue forward. The latest steps by Iran when it comes to enrichment, uranium enrichment, and the insufficient level of cooperation with the IAEA are not giving very optimistic feel to the overall atmosphere in these efforts.
Thank you for watching TV7 Israel News. I would like to express our deepest appreciation for TV7 Israel's family of supporters. TV7 Israel is a donation-based ministry, and therefore, your financial contributions essentially enable us to sustain our ongoing operations here in Jerusalem. Additionally, I would like to encourage you to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters worldwide for the peace of Jerusalem and salvation of Israel. I'm Jonathan Essen, wishing you a Shavua Mevorach, and God willing, we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time.